Welcome back for episode 7 of Disturbing Reddit Posts. This time we're going to be focusing on AskReddit, and the format is going to be a little different. Rather than covering 3 or 4 longer posts, we'll take a look at many more shorter comments, ranging from eerie personal mysteries and horrifying stories to events that are so shocking they sound like conspiracy theories. Let me know in the comments if you like this format, and I could even do a separate series focusing on AskReddit. Anyway, let's investigate. If you enjoy internet mysteries and generally disturbing content, feel free to subscribe and turn on notifications for more content like this. If you're interested in supporting the channel, you can become a Ko-fi member or a channel member to gain access to uncut videos and other perks, or you can leave me a tip by clicking the thanks under this video. Thanks to anyone who considers this. This video will contain discussions of topics that some might find triggering. Viewer discretion is advised. You can become a Ko-fi member to watch an uncut version of this video, which features extra details that were unsuitable for this cut. All the posts we'll cover in this video are very recent, the first one being 1 month old at the time I'm writing this script. It was titled, "What is the most unexplainable mystery that's happened in your life?" One of the top comments read, "Halloween 1983. We were really new in town. 2 people in hooded black costumes barged into our house when we answered the door thinking they were trick-or-treaters. They handed us a card asking us to guess who they were, giving us 3 guesses. If we guessed right, they would unmask. They sat down on our couch. We did our 3 guesses and all were apparently wrong. They shot up from the couch and wandered out the door again. Still don't know." Edit. For the record, I was 10, my sister was 7. It was one of us who answered the door that time. They barged in, slowly. By the time my mum walked into the room, they were sitting down on the couch. If I'd been a smarter kid, I should have locked the door behind them and not let them go until they'd unmasked. And yes, it was the 80s, and we thought this was a thing in this town. There's something called bell snickling, but that's done more at Christmas. But no one ever pulled that stunt on us ever again." Well, I guess that's what happens when you choose trick rather than treat. But seriously, this is absolutely bizarre. Thankfully, no one was actually harmed in this interaction, but I'd be terrified if I was in that situation and would have probably just run straight out of the house as they barged in. I can't believe OP is saying they should have locked the door behind them and not let them go. Even though they turned out to be seemingly harmless, you don't know if that would have still been the case if they got locked in the house. I'm gonna guess this was just some teenagers messing around, but it's still a very bold move to force your way into someone's home. OP replied to a comment saying their money is on it being one of their dad's fellow teachers and his wife, who do odd things once in a while. You'd think if the intruders knew OP or their family, they would have owned up to it at some point though. I had to Google what bell snickling is as I've never heard of it. It's an ancient German tradition that was popular in parts of West Virginia until the mid-20th century, involving a group of people dressed in masquerade, knocking on their neighbours' doors and getting them to guess who they are. Sometimes the bellsnickles were given seasonal treats like candy and cider, so it sounds kinda similar to trick-or-treating with a twist. Apparently it's almost unheard of in West Virginia today, but OP's story was back in the 80s, so it does sound like a quite extreme example of that. Here's another comment on the post. Peanut the Jesus rat. Pet rat named Peanut died from a baseball-sized tumour. Put her stiff body in a big Ziploc bag and put her in the freezer so we could bury her when the weather warmed up. 3 days later we heard rustling from the freezer, opened it to find Peanut alive and with no sign of the tumour. I've heard stories in the past of animals and even people who seemingly froze to death before coming back to life. For example, Jean Hilliard, a 19-year-old woman who was driving home to her parents' house in Minnesota in the snow when a car skidded off the road. Unable to get her car running again, she decided to trek to her friend Wally's house, who lived nearby. The next morning, Wally left his home to find Jean frozen solid just 15 feet away from his front door. She had collapsed after getting hypothermia, and Wally dragged her onto his porch, assuming she was dead. He called an ambulance, and miraculously, doctors were able to thaw Jean with an electric blanket, and she made a full recovery. The Reddit story is even more baffling though. Peanut was already dead when she was put in the freezer. It's crazy that she not only came back to life without freezing after being in the freezer for 3 days, and her tumour was gone. OP replied to their own comment to add some more details. The tumour was nowhere to be found, so we assume that somehow the cold brought her back to life and she chewed it and ate it. We had 7 rats at one point and it was miserable. They stunk up the whole house. I hated them, but my wife got carried away with rescuing them. Peanut was the nicest one, but the tumour got so big she couldn't move and had to stay next to the food dish. She was dead as can be when we found her one day. Completely cold, and her whole body was stiff from rigor mortis, including the tail. When she came back to life, she was less friendly and didn't want my wife touching her anymore. The tumour started growing back, and in 6 months it was back to baseball sized and she died again. She's buried in the backyard. Or is she? I find this story so unsettling. Peanut coming back to life in the first place is bizarre, and her personality changing after makes it even eerier in my opinion. Another user shared a similar story in response. Damn, this just reminded me of something that happened to me when I was a kid. A neighbourhood friend of mine had a betta fish. I'd slept over at her house, and in the morning we suddenly noticed the fish was not in the bowl. We figured it jumped out, and we desperately looked for it, hoping we could get it back in the bowl before it died. We could not find it, and I mean we searched and searched. Finally, we decided her dog must have eaten the fish before we noticed it was missing. The next evening, we are rearranging the furniture in her room. While doing this, I find the missing betta fish on the opposite side of the room from his bowl, on the floor, dried up like a potato chip. We plop it back in the bowl, and the fish rehydrates slowly and seemingly comes back to life. I know betta fish can survive short periods out of water, but being out of water for more than 24 hours, I still can't believe it. These stories make me think of those safety coffins they had in the Victorian era that had a string that could be pulled inside the coffin to ring a bell above the ground. Because medical knowledge was nowhere near as advanced as it is today, it wasn't unheard of for people to be buried alive after they were pronounced dead, but were in fact just unconscious or in a coma. My family always had cats when I was growing up, and when one of them died, my mum would always insist on waiting a few days before we buried them in the garden, in case they weren't actually dead. I always thought it was kinda ridiculous, and of course none of them ended up coming back to life, but after reading these stories, I'm starting to think she was right to be cautious. Another comment on this post with a different story read, "This one time I fell asleep in a cheap hotel room and woke up the next day in a completely separate room, like I'd been carried and placed there very carefully on top of the covers. I was lying straight with my hands resting on my belly when I woke. I went down to reception and told them and asked them to open my old room to see if my stuff was all in there. It was. I packed my shit and they made me pay for 2 rooms. Not sure what happened, I was too scared to ask, I just left. But how did I not wake up? I'm a really big guy, 120 kilograms. It would have had to have been like 4 men carrying me. It haunts me sometimes, but I just try not to think about it too much. On my life, this happened." OP implied his sister suggested that it was the hotel staff who moved him into a different room so he'd have to pay extra. I guess it's the most plausible theory, especially considering he wasn't robbed and his room was locked before and after he was transported out of there. But how would they even do that? As OP said, he's not a small guy. He guessed it'd take around 4 men to carry him out, and regardless of his size, surely he'd have woken up at some point as he was picked up, moved to a totally different room, and placed on a totally different bed. Unless he was drugged, I guess. but this all seems like a lot of effort to go to for the extra $75 he had to pay for the other room. Another comment suggested aliens, which is also unlikely in my opinion. I honestly can't think of a more feasible explanation there. Another user posted a kind of similar story elsewhere in the thread. Quote, "Riding in the car with my mum when I was 16, we're headed home from the grocery store. It was dark out. We lived in the suburbs and were taking a familiar route home, just going straight. Heading up a small hill, through an intersection with a traffic light and a convenience store on our right, then approach a corner that weaves through a small wooded area, when suddenly we're back at the hill, approaching the same intersection with the convenience store we just drove through, like time was rewinded 30 seconds. I begin to say, 'Mum, what just happened?' And she is already in tears and asks me to please just shut up a second and let me think. Told anyone I trusted about it. Typing it out gives me the creeps all over again." OP's mum's reaction leads me to believe that there's more to this story that she's aware of and OP isn't. It's certainly a concerning situation, and I'd be perplexed to say the least, shaken up even, but I'm not sure I'd be in tears over it, and this is coming from someone who's cried at a spider before. Admittedly, I am a little dozy, not enough to not even realise something was wrong in this situation, but enough that I'd probably find a way to convince myself that I was somehow mistaken. When asked by another user what OP's mum says if they bring it up now, they said, "She's dead now, but she refused to really talk about it after. She was scared. It was weird AF. Sometimes I would just poke her about it playfully, like, 'Mum, remember that shit when we were driving?' And she would be very quick to hush me up about it." Even if the mum was, understandably, in shock at the time and didn't want to speak about it, you'd think years later she'd eventually say something. Again, it seems that something else happened that OP isn't aware of. It makes me wonder if OP is misremembering and the truth is actually much darker. What if their mum actually hit someone with the car, or something like that, and OP was aware at the time, but their brain quickly created some kind of false memory to cope with such a traumatic event, so she recalls it as an unexplainable blip, having repressed the part where a potential accident occurred. It would explain why the mum seemed so upset at the time and why she never wanted to talk about it after that. The next AskReddit thread we're going to look at asked, "What's the most f***ed up story you've heard?" I'm not sure there's much I can add in the way of commentary for most of these, so I'm just going to read some of the most disturbing replies and let them speak for themselves. I do not have any relation with it, but I do know of someone involved in the story. In a Catholic church/hospital in Spain, during the 30s all the way up to the 70s, the doctor and the nuns working there used to help give birth to pregnant women, but around 1 out of 4 of the women gave birth to an already dead baby. Turns out the doctor and the nuns had a long dead, frozen newborn stored in a freezing chamber, which they used to show to those women, telling them their baby had died in the process. All of this while taking away their alive and healthy babies so they could sell the babies to wealthy families or orphanages. I don't want to imagine the pain of being a mother thinking you've lost your baby, only for it to be sold to another couple of parents. I knew a guy who was caught with CP. The cops found it hidden under his bed after receiving an anonymous tip. He worked with children, so he instantly lost his job even before any investigation. He killed himself shortly after the material was found. After he died, his young son came forward to admit he had framed his father and put the pictures under his bed and called the police himself because he was mad at him. The dad was innocent the whole time. I want to add so much more to explain how great this guy was. The story should be on the news to clear his name. Everyone should know he was framed, but that would ruin his son's life, and it's really only his story to tell. My ex-wife's aunt came home after work and saw her husband sitting on a stump, leaning on an axe in the backyard. She assumed he was taking a break from chopping firewood, so she made coffee. She took his out to him and found out he had slipped. The axe cut his leg, he sat on the stump and he bled out. The only thing propping him up was the axe. He had been dead since about noon. The story has never left my brain. My brother-in-law is an engineer in the northwest of England. He mentioned about a time working in a molten metals factory where one guy fell into a vat of molten aluminium. It was an unfortunate working accident and they drained the vat, and the only thing left was the steel toe caps from his boots. It resonates with me as at some point when the guy fell, he knew what was coming and he had no way to stop it. This happened to one of my friend's sister's best friend. She went on a date with a guy from Tinder. Everything seemed normal until she suddenly wakes up in her own bed and can hear noise coming from the kitchen, so she climbs under the bed and calls the police. Police come, arrest the guy, make sure she's okay, and say they need to take her to the station, but to cover her eyes as they're leaving the apartment. She takes a glance while going through the kitchen. The whole room is covered in those plastic sheets, a series of knives and other such instruments on the ground. The guy got the dosage wrong and she woke up early. Just a warning before I read this next comment, it's somewhat vague but is about animal abuse, so feel free to skip past this one if you don't want to hear it. Okay, so this is a story my mum told me that's from her childhood. I think she was about 9 or 10 at the time, and this took place during the 70s in a small town in Italy. Her and her friends would often play in the countryside and would encounter all the regular locals. They were all nice, friendly people, other than this elderly widow who my mum said had a reputation for being weird. My mum would soon witness for herself just how true this was. One day, my mum and her sister were walking down a lane in the countryside and bumped into this woman who was walking with a big sack over her shoulder. She opened the sack to show them what was inside without saying anything, and she revealed a dozen tiny kittens. At first, my mum and her sister were excited because they thought maybe the lady would let them keep some, but the lady proceeded to close the sack and then repeatedly bash the sack on the concrete. My mum says she'll never forget the sound of the kittens meowing and crying inside the sack before it went silent. I once was on a bench taking photos of surfers and one of them wanted to buy some shots of himself. Well, I got them printed up, and when I tried to get a hold of the dude, I found out he had done a bunch of hallucinogens and killed his roommate and fed the friend's heart to his dog and supposedly ate some himself. I will add a little to this one to assure you, as much as it sounds crazy enough that it could be a fabricated story, it isn't. Opie actually shared a news article and the photos of the man that he posted on Flickr at the time to prove it. The man was named Jared Wyatt, and the part about him and his dog eating the victim's heart seems to have been a local rumour, but he did remove the heart and the tongue, believing his friend was the devil due to the hallucinations, and ended up agreeing to a plea deal resulting in him serving 50 years to life in prison. The final post we'll cover was titled, "What's a fact that sounds like a conspiracy theory?" The first comment read, "Probably going to be buried, but this one is actually kind of funny. Sometime after World War II, the US was doing some pretty wild experiments, including trying to see if they could teach dolphins to talk. They believed this was only achievable by full immersion, so they built a house and filled it with water and had a researcher live with the dolphin. The dolphin was a young male and wouldn't respond to anything unless the female researcher jacked it off. It became too obsessed with the researcher, and I think when the higher-ups found out what was going on, they shut it down and never tried again. Kind of paraphrased, but yeah, the government paid a fuckload of money just to end up having a lady whack off a dolphin." This comment actually leaves out half the story, and when you hear the rest, I'm sure you'll think it's anything but funny. The dolphin was named Peter, and the woman who was hired to try and communicate with him was named Margaret. Sometime into the experiment, Margaret realised that Peter's urges were beginning to disrupt the lessons. There were 2 female dolphins in the pool with Peter, and at first she tried to encourage him to go down with them, but eventually reasoned that it would be easier for her to relieve the urges herself. John Lilly, who was running the study, had also been researching LSD, even taking it himself so he could understand the effects, as well as injecting animals, including the other 2 dolphins in the tank with Peter. Margaret managed to prevent Peter from being injected, convincing John it would be detrimental to the study. By this point, Margaret and Peter had formed a very close bond. In an article for The Guardian, she was quoted as saying, "That relationship of having to be together sort of turned into really enjoying being together and wanting to be together and missing him when he wasn't there. I did have a very close encounter with, I can't even say dolphin again, with Peter." This was after she spoke about helping him relieve his urges, so I don't even want to think about what she meant by that. And here's where things get really depressing. Funding for the experiment was eventually cut, so it had to be stopped after 6 months and the lab was closed, meaning Peter would be sent to another lab, kept in a much smaller tank with little or no sunlight. He quickly deteriorated, and within a few weeks, Margaret got a call to say that he had taken his own life. Dolphins are not automatic air breathers like humans, so Peter had simply taken a breath of air, sank to the bottom of the tank, and decided not to take another breath. While Margaret was devastated about having to leave Peter, she understood the situation, whereas Peter didn't. In his mind, he was in a relationship with her and she left him. How is a dolphin supposed to understand that? So what on the surface may seem like a somewhat amusing and almost unbelievable story is actually an incredibly tragic, true tale when you know all the details. After the Reddit comment left out so much information, I wondered if I missed anything else, so to see how else it was being covered, I searched the story in Ground News, the sponsor of this video. If you haven't heard of Ground News, it's an app and website that combines articles from around the world in one place so you can compare what's being reported or left out of media coverage. It allows you to see the distribution of left and right-wing content, the ownership data of each news source, i.e. if the source is independent, government-funded, or owned by a corporation, etc. One of the most useful resources for my research is a factuality score, which tells you which sources are high factuality and which are mixed. So when I searched this dolphin story on Ground News, I found 5 more articles published about it. I could compare the headlines and coverage details and was able to see that The Guardian was the only independent-owned media with 0% government-funded coverage. However, National Post was the only source that was rated high factuality, and this allowed me to fact-check the details I read in the Guardian article. This makes Ground News an invaluable tool for research, enabling you to evaluate what's being reported and also highlighting what isn't being reported. Their blind spot feed is particularly useful for discovering stories that you might be missing, which is really important so you can have a less biased view of world events. I highly recommend checking it out by going to ground.news/investigator. You can subscribe through my link for less than $1 a month, or take advantage of their biggest discount of the year and get 40% off unlimited access to the Vantage subscription, which is what I use. The next fact that sounds like a conspiracy was mentioned in a comment that read, "The UK government secretly tested biological weapons on its own coastal towns to see how far they could make it inland." To provide some context, in 2002, it was revealed in the government release of a comprehensive history of Britain's biological weapon trials that the Ministry of Defence had conducted over 100 covert germ warfare tests on the British public to predict what would happen if Russia were to launch an attack on Britain in this way. Military personnel were instructed to tell any members of the public who inquired about the chemicals that it was related to research projects into weather and air pollution. In most of the trials, the Ministry of Defence wasn't unleashing actual biological weapons, but rather alternatives designed to mimic them that were supposed to be harmless. However, a number of families who were living in the targeted areas at the time of the trials believed it caused birth defects in their children. The chemicals that were released include zinc cadmium sulfide between 1955 and 1963, E. coli and Bacillus globigii, which has similar effects to anthrax, between 1961 and 1968, and Serratia marcescens bacteria, with an anthrax stimulant and phenol from 1971 to 1975. According to The Guardian, which covered this story in 2002, when asked if these or similar tests were still being carried out, Sue Ellison, a spokeswoman for Porton Downs, said, "It is not our policy to discuss ongoing research. Make of that what you will." The final comment doesn't exactly sound like a conspiracy theory, but I guess it's enough of a coincidence that it could sound like a fabricated story if you didn't know otherwise. In the spring of 1968, President Lyndon Johnson shocked the nation when he announced that he would not seek election to a second full term that November. He gave no explanation, and pretty much everyone assumed that it was because of the situation in Vietnam and his resulting unpopularity. While Vietnam undoubtedly was a factor, it was far from the full story. Concerned that males in his family tended to die young, and having barely survived a heart attack in the 1950s, sometime in 1967, Johnson had commissioned a top-secret actuarial study to determine his likely lifespan. After carefully going through his family history and medical records, the actuaries concluded that Johnson was unlikely to survive to age 65. Johnson quickly did the math and realised that would give him a very short retirement if he ran and won in 1968, as he'd be 64 at the end of the term. This led him to decide against running. The actuaries were right, as Johnson never made it to 65, dying at age 64. And indeed, it would have been a very short retirement. Had he served a second full term, he would have died less than 24 hours after the end of the term. I'd be interested to hear in the comments how many of you watching this would actually want to know when you are going to die. Of course, there's no way to 100% accurately determine it, but in this case it happened to be an accurate prediction. On one hand, if you knew the date of your death, you could plan your life around it until then, as President Johnson did, attempting to ensure he got at least 4 years of retirement. On the other hand, would you even enjoy your last few years, knowing you don't have long left? Surely you'd just be counting down the days until your inevitable demise. Maybe this is one of those situations where ignorance is bliss, and I guess this story serves as a reminder to live each day as if it is your last. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts in the comments, plus any suggestions you might have for a future video. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing. Huge thank you to my Ko-fi members and channel members whose names are on screen now. I really appreciate your support. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week in a new video.